Yesterday morning, there was a lot of discussion about the need to assess situations. And so I'm going to tell you about work that we've been doing in my lab recently that has tried in a very constrained way to look at situations, and in particular at age differences in situation selection and situation modification that I think have implications for mixed emotions. And I want to especially acknowledge two people in my lab who have been most instrumental in this work, Kimberly Livingstone and Molly Sands. We do not study mixed emotional experience per se, and it's sort of even worse than that. Our methods currently preclude us from doing so because for technological reasons having to do with the logistics of recording mood while people are, for example, having their eyes tracked, we tend to force our participants across studies to make ratings about their current mood experience in the lab task using a slider or a dial or just saying a number out loud that we then record. And we do not give them the opportunity to express mixed emotional experience in the moment. They usually are just giving us, doing the rating on a positive negative scale. And so I apologize for that. There are reasons for it. Even though our measurement approach precludes us from assessing mixed emotional experience in a moment, what we do have to offer, I believe, is that we assess people's behavior in environments that feature mixed emotional input. And so what I hope to convince you of is that we can learn at least something about mixed emotional experience by looking at people's behavior in environments that have mixed emotional content. And so I'll show you a bunch of different ways that we have tried to look at people's behavior in these mixed emotional environments. I'm going to try to breeze through the sort of background and theory since you've heard a lot of it yesterday, especially in Susan's great talk, so I can get to the paradigms and the data. Our starting point has been findings like this one from the MIDA study that older adults report higher levels of positive affect and lower levels of negative affect. That sort of finding always raises sort of implicit questions about are there age differences in how people regulate how they feel. If older people say they're feeling better, they must be doing something to achieve that good feeling. And we had some evidence a number of years ago that spontaneously older adults were more likely to regulate how they felt out of bad moods, even when not instructed to, than were younger adults. And so these are reasons that we've been interested in emotion regulation as a potential pathway that leads older adults to report more positive affective experience. And we've been guided in our attempt to understand how older people get to these relatively positive affective experiences by two related but distinct literatures, socio-emotional selectivity theory, which Susan introduced us to yesterday, as well as the process model of emotion regulation, which was alluded to yesterday as well. And these approaches, by trying to put them together in some sense, have allowed us to design paradigms and to do some hypothesis testing around what specifically does and does not vary by age in terms of people's potential emotion regulatory behavior. So Susan again gave us a great introduction to SST yesterday. What I want to focus on for our purposes today is that we've been guided by SST as a motivational way to understand the mechanisms that older adults may use to achieve the outcomes of feeling good. So with a more limited time perspective, older adults are thought to prioritize emotional goals. This leads to positivity effects in their information processing, attention, and memory, and potentially to positive affective outcomes for older adults as well. This is a great framework to put into mixed emotional environments because the SST is telling us that older adults' goals when processing emotional information directs them more towards positive information. This should help them feel better. So it guides us in terms of looking at people's behavior in mixed emotional environments. Environments that have mixed emotional input should bring out age differences in goals, information processing, and thus in mood. The process model of emotion regulation was developed by James Gross to give us sort of a language for different strategies that individuals may use to regulate their emotions. So it specifies different types of strategies that people may use. And this is one representation of that model. From putting oneself into a particular situation to then modifying the situation, focusing attention on some versus other aspects of the situation, and then reappraising or suppressing a response Each of these are strategies or behaviors one may engage in when faced with an emotion elicitor that could have the potential to affect one's emotional response to that elicitor. For example, to downregulate negative response to something that could make you feel bad. And what we have tried to do is to sort of to marry the idea of SST and age-related positivity effects with a process model to think about to what extent older adults may prefer relatively more positive versions of each of the strategies specified by the process model, and whether use of those strategies by older adults help them feel better. And so I want to focus today on the first three strategies: situation selection, situation modification, and attentional deployment. I've argued, and I just want to mention this briefly, that we have to ask separately about whether age differences in use of strategies, and then distinctly whether there are age differences in whether using those strategies leads to feeling good. So I call the first one preference and the second one effectiveness. They're both important questions. I'm going to focus primarily on preference or age differences in use or behavior today because that's what I have the most data on. So I'm not going to talk about attention deployment today, even though that's been the focus of my work for a number of years, other than to summarize a number of studies to say that there is pretty good evidence, I would say, from the emotion regulation strategy of attentional deployment that is consistent with the idea of age-related positivity effects. Older adults seem to prefer to look more at positive and less at negative stimuli in their environment. And this does appear to be effective in leading at least some older adults to feel good. And so I do believe that in the attention deployment domain, there's pretty good evidence that older adults are more positive, and they use that as a strategy, and it's a helpful strategy for them. Today I want to tell you about work that we've done more recently testing other regulatory strategies, and in particular the even earlier ones. So situation selection and situation modification. Here people are in environments with an array of positive, negative, and critically, and I'll come back to this, neutral information, and we can see what they do. And we can also try to manipulate goals and see if goal states change behavior as predicted by socio-emotional selectivity theory. So situation selection, what would be the positive version of that if we're trying to put together these two approaches? We can ask whether older adults choose more positive and less negative situations. And Susan gave a really wonderful introduction to her theory savvy, which makes a strong hypothesis that older adults should avoid particularly negative situations. And Susan also mentioned great work by Kira here, behavioral data suggesting that at least in relationships, older adults do report avoiding conflict. And there's really great reason to think that earlier regulation and situation selection, at least in the process model, is the earliest possible strategy, should be either easier or better for older adults for a number of reasons. But how do we study situation selection? So I want to tell you today about one sort of meta paradigm we've developed and then tried out in a number of different ways in different studies. It is very limited and there are lots of problems with it, but it's a way of studying situations. And here we're going to define situation selection as selecting to get more information about something, or selecting to expose yourself to something in an environment. So we call this the affective environment. It looks different in different studies. This is just one example. But the basic idea is that we present our participants with an array of different potential emotional inputs. They always vary in valence. They sometimes vary in arousal. They sometimes vary in modality, so sometimes there's a mix of videos, web pages, newspaper articles, sometimes they're only videos depending on the study. Sometimes we tell people where to find which valence and sometimes we don't. But the general idea is that we put people in an environment where they can sort of decide what situation to place themselves in terms of what information they expose themselves to, and then we see what they do. And so we think this is an analog for situation selection. So we've done a number of studies, and I want to just briefly mention sort of first findings and then tell you about some more recent findings from a couple of studies. First, we simply used behavioral measures, sort of time spent on different choices. We found no main effective age in a sample just of younger and older adults. In a second study, we added in mobile eye tracking, which is like typical eye tracking, but people can move around more. And again, we found no main effective age in terms of people's choices. There was great similarity across the age groups in what people chose. In terms of effectiveness, mood, not surprisingly, tracks with choices. People feel better when they choose more positive content. They feel worse when they choose more negative content, and that does not vary as a function of age. More recently, we've tried to sort of constrain the emotional landscape a little bit by first inducing moods in a sample of young, middle-aged, and older adults, and then putting them in the affective environment. They have 15 minutes to spend watching various content. Here we also manipulated goals by telling half of our subjects to just view whatever is interesting to them, and the other half were asked specifically to try to minimize their negative emotions or feelings. And I want to show you just the behavioral results from this study. It turns out that there were effects of mood and of induction and goal, but they're primarily on mood outcomes. And I just want to focus on behavior for the sake of time. When we look at what emotional content did participants choose to engage with, here we actually get no age differences yet again between the younger and older people, but the middle-age sample actually was the age group that behaved differently. So this percent of choices of each type. You can see that people choose across types, and I'll come back to this at the end. People choose a variety of emotional inputs, and basically everybody does. Nobody goes all positive or all negative. And here was actually the middle-age sample that chose slightly more negative content and slightly less neutral content within their 15 minutes, didn't vary as a function of mood induction, condition, or instructions. We then tried to sort of take a different approach to this question of what do people choose to expose themselves to. I have this memory of this paper from the 80s that nobody's replicated since then, but it was an observational study, I think, of people, of older people in Germany that found that something like 70% of waking hours were spent with a television on, and it's hard to know how that would be affected now in the digital age, but watching TV is a common environment that older people find themselves in, and is one in which they have to make choices. And so a particularly intrepid undergraduate in my lab actually took a Comcast remote control and rigged it so that we could have subjects use it to change channels on a computer screen. Do not please tell Comcast, because I will have even more problems with them than I usually do if they know that we have now rigged their remote controls. But we actually created a set of cable networks with content that varied in valence and arousal, and we gave our participants a remote, and they got channel information like you would if you're watching TV, and we named the channels things that gave information about the valence and arousal level. And here we did use both valence and arousal, but because there's no high arousal neutral, but we do include neutral as a valence, I'm going to show you results separately for valence and arousal. So people could change the channel, and you don't see it here, but they would see at the bottom of the screen like, really cute things or extremely scary. So it would give some valence and arousal information. We just told people, watch whatever is interesting to you. Use the remote, you have 15 minutes, go crazy, whatever you want to do. When we look at, I need to go back to valence. When we look at time spent on channels as a function of the valence of the channel, what you'll see, and here we did not have middle-aged subjects in this study, but we are collecting that data now in a follow-up study. No age difference in how much people looked at the negative channels. The older adults looked more at the neutral channels than the younger adults and less at the positive ones. Though really, what you can sort of see is that there's no age difference negative, and then the rest is sort of positive plus neutral. So it seems like older adults are substituting some positive content for neutral. I'll come back to that at the end. When you look at arousal, I think this is nice in terms of consistency with some of the Savvy's predictions. Older adults clearly are preferring to watch the low arousal channels, though they are choosing some of the high arousal ones too. It's not an entirely low arousal strategy, but certainly their older adults are preferring the low arousal channels. So back to the affective environment. In a recent study, we didn't have middle-aged people in this study, but here we tried to, again, manipulate goals in a situation selection environment, and the instructions were the same. We didn't manipulate pre-mood in this study. And here, what we found was that there was general similarity in what people chose, whether they were young or old, or whether they were told to regulate or just view. Our exception cell was the younger adults here who were told to just look at what was interesting to them. They were the ones that chose the most negative content and less neutral and less positive content compared to the older adults. So it seemed that younger people, sort of without instruction to regulate how they were feeling, looked more at negative content in an affective environment situation. This again was back in the not a TV paradigm. So this supports the idea that perhaps there are something about goals and that older adults' default state is consistent with the goal of regulating their emotion, and so that would explain the choices here. We can also see that the findings are a little bit mixed depending on the paradigm. We norm all the stimuli before each study in terms of age, valence, and arousal ratings, but then we do have to vary the stimuli for some reasons, and so we have another side project where we're trying to sort of figure out why the age findings vary a little bit between no age difference and some age differences in each study. But I want to focus here on the paradigm we developed for situation modification. So this is the second strategy. And it's really hard to think about how you would study situation modification in the lab. We have these grand plans of like a lab-based choose your own adventure thing, but we just haven't we haven't quite figured it out yet, but maybe soon. So our sort of low-tech version of situation modification that we developed was we showed participants in the study a variety of different film clips that had been pre-rated for having positive or negative valence, and we gave participants the opportunity to fast forward through parts of the videos on the idea that you can modify sort of your level of exposure to input, sort of a proxy for situation modification, by either watching something or fast forwarding. And these were clips that sort of these were clips that built up over them. Here are the examples, and the last one we've changed. This study was done pre-controversy, or at least current controversy. So this study, now we don't use the last one. I figured I might get a question about that. So we measured to what extent people fast forward through these videos or watch them in their entirety, and here higher numbers indicate percent watched. And so we again manipulated, we had half the subjects told to just watch whatever was interesting to them, other half told to try to minimize their negative feelings. And what you find is an age by valence interaction. So this is the first sort of typical positivity effects age by valence interaction that I'm going to show you, where older adults were fast forwarded more, so they watched less of the negative videos than the younger adults, but there was no age difference in the amount of fast forwarding or watching of the positive videos. So based on these findings, and again, particularly the situation selection findings are quite mixed. They're not consistent from study to study, and we're trying to, again, figure out what's going on specifically there, but I think it still leads to some interesting potential conclusions. Even though we don't have mixed emotional experience as a dependent variable, focusing on mixed emotional environments that people decide to put themselves in really strongly suggests that people actively choose to expose themselves to a mixture of emotional inputs. So again, it was very, very uncommon, and I think that there are actually no cases where somebody chose entirely positive or entirely negative, and you could spend the entire 15 minutes and not change valence. We've basically never had that happen. People expose themselves to a mix of emotional inputs actively. Some environments lead to no age differences in behavior, other environments do. I think there's a suggestion from these results that older adults may prefer neutral, and so if we don't have neutral, we may miss that, though it's hard to include neutral. It means that we can't fully cross arousal and valence, for example. But this idea that neutral may have more intrinsically positive properties for older adults, I think is important as we move ahead in thinking about measurement of mixed emotional experience. It seems like situation modification shows relatively more age-related positivity than situation selection, and midlife in particular seems to be critical, though we only have that in some studies, though we now are going back to most of the paradigms I've shown you today and retesting people in midlife. Given that people in aging tend to hypothesize about midlife, well, it's going to be halfway between, it's going to be between young adult and old age. It seems like that's prime time for mixed emotions, though in fact, by some tokens, it may be that midlife will show more extreme patterns depending on the age-related tendency, but I can talk more about that if people have questions. So in conclusion, age differences seem more pronounced for some aspects of interacting with the environment than others. I think that one possible conclusion is that there are relatively fewer age differences in what people find interesting, but there are maybe greater age differences in how people engage with it. In the studies that we've done that have mobile eye tracking, it's extremely labor intensive to use the eye tracking data to look specifically at, let's say somebody chooses a negative video, how much do they look at the really icky parts of that video versus not. That's a trivial task in stationary eye tracking, and we do it all the time. But in mobile eye tracking, because of the nature of the technology, once people are untethered from a screen, it actually becomes a bigger technical problem to figure out exactly what on the screen they're looking at. So we are working on it, but it takes a long time, so I don't have that data yet. But it seems that the age differences may be most pronounced not in sort of what channel people choose, but in how they look at the channel that they've chosen and how they actually interact with that information. I do think also that arousal clearly matters. And just in closing, I think one implication of this work for mixed emotional experience is that we shouldn't be surprised if people when given the opportunity, people report mixed emotional experiences because they're actively exposing themselves to mixed emotional input. Thanks very much.